right. Here we are. Another episode. Thanks for joining, man.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, what you're doing, what you're trying to accomplish, all that jazz.
Yeah, definitely. So my name is Nahed Khairallah. I have been in the HR consulting space since 2011, and I pretty much specialize in helping fast-growing startups, typically those who start hitting some kind of success, seven-figure revenue mark and so forth, help them scale towards 8 and 9 figures. And I do that through the HR lens and what I call helping companies scale by turning HR into rocket fuel for their growth as really that enabler for helping them grow. I've worked with more than 150 companies over my career through the US, Middle East, Africa, Europe. So some international experience there. Did a lot of work as a self-employed business owner with my own consulting firm. And today I also the founder of Organized Chaos, which is, a firm dedicated to helping those seven-figure companies grow to 9 figures. And I also have a podcast under the same name, Organized Chaos, which, provides advice to startup founders and leaders who are really going through that scaling process, and especially those who haven't gone through it before, who have had some missteps, just try to give them some shortcuts and advice on how to sort of get over the hump with some of the things that I see over and over again that I've seen with all of these companies I've worked with.
I can totally relate to that, and I'm super stoked to talk to you too, because I think, in my opinion, as a startup founder, as an entrepreneur, I think that HR and people is the hardest thing in business. Literally the hardest thing.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's when people think of HR, typically they think of all the fluffy stuff, the
hmm
people's emotions, all that kind of stuff. But I mean, if you drill down to it and you just take a step back, HR really is about helping you set the infrastructure in place to enable your company to reach its full potential and the goals you've actually set out for it. Because at the end of the day, especially in today's knowledge-based economy, it's the people who do the work.
hmm
And if you're not doing what you can to actually put them in a position where they can do the work and help you succeed, you're not making good investments, you're not making good decisions, and you're actually not helping your company grow. On the contrary, you might actually contribute to helping your company fail.
hmm Yeah. I think, and it's funny you're saying that, because my last episode, we talked about this very thing, because as an entrepreneur, especially when you're starting off, you're the one that's wearing many hats, right? You're the one that's doing all of the jobs in the business until you can grow the revenue to a point where you can hire somebody to start doing those jobs. And typically, most entrepreneurs, when they hire somebody, their first hire is usually an admin person, right? It's the person to handle all the paperwork, the payroll, the AP checks, balancing the bank, which
That
makes complete
catch-all person.
sense. Yeah. Um, but then at the same time, it's if you can afford it. Actually, I guess you could say you really can't not try and afford it, is to hire somebody to do the sales and marketing for you first, because that's what drives growth.
Yeah, I mean, this is really a conversation I have with a lot of founders. I mean, when you want to look at what contributes to a startup success, there's really three elements there. First one is the product market fit, right? If you don't have that, then you don't have anything to grow and to sell,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're going to lose out of the market just because whatever you're selling isn't really something that the market wants. The second thing is financial sustainability. So
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have, and again, that could be bootstrap, that could be VC backed, whatever your form of financing, but if you're not deploying your finances in a smart way, your company isn't going to gain traction. The last piece of the puzzle is the people, having the right people there. And again, a lot of times when founders are growing their companies, definitely and very logically, the first thing on their mind is revenue growth. It
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense because
Yeah.
without that, without the product market fit and the revenue growth, you can't do anything else. So that's why when I speak to founders and work with them, I never say that HR is the be all end all. It is the enabler of the business. It
Mm-hmm.
enables you to do what you want to do. It's not going to help you overcome product market fit. It's not going to help you overcome your financial issues, right? Those are business fundamentals you need to have in check. But assuming you have those in place and there are some sound decisions and sound foundations on those two elements, then the people portion is important because around 25% of startups actually fail because of people related issues. and that's not a small number,
Right.
right? Which is usually it's usually an afterthought to founders because they only think of HR stuff and people stuff when they start seeing problems. The ones who've been through it multiple times, they get it, and they're like, you know what, I need to preemptively and proactively actually start doing some of these things, so I don't get into the same mess I got into in my first startup, second startup, and so forth.
I think, in my opinion, probably one of the best examples of that is Steve Jobs, right? He's really like, he didn't really have any extreme talents, right? He wasn't a coder. He wasn't, anything financial guru or anything like that, but he just knew how to assemble teams and get people to do things that he can't do.
Yeah, that's such an amazing example because, and to your point, founders as they grow their companies, a lot of times they get stuck in trying to do everything, and they try to avoid delegating more and more. What I tell founders a lot is you want to work as hard as you can to put yourself out of a daily job.
Yeah.
You become the person who is focusing on the vision of your organization, setting the strategic goals, and working with your teams to help them work towards that vision. But you're not necessarily the one who's delivering on anything per se.
Right.
That's kind of what you want to get to. The reason I say that is because if you don't do that, your capacity ends up determining your ability to scale. And human beings don't scale very well. I mean, an individual has a certain level of capacity. And if as a founder, you're bottlenecking everything through you are actually deliberately forcing yourself to hit a certain ceiling, and your company will actually suffer as a result.
So, what were the things that because your resume talks about, taking companies from 6 and 7 figures to 9 figures plus, and especially being able to grow geographically as well across the US or across the world. So, what were some of the things that you implemented that helped scale those companies to that degree?
Yeah, no, the great question. So the first thing I look at and the first thing I like to understand from any company is what is your end game? What are you trying to accomplish? And that could take many forms. For example, there might be a founder who's interested in growing a business that will live on for 30 years and then they give that off to their kids. Some people want to exit in 5 years, right? So there's different outcomes here that we're looking at. Now, depending on what the outcome is, my goal when I come in is I want to help you reach that outcome because the outcome is yours and yours alone, right? That is what you want to reach with your company. My goal is to help you get there. What I do after I understand, okay, this is the goal. What are you trying to do from a business perspective day to day? I look at the financial statements. I look at the actual operation. Now, a lot of people, when I tell them this, are like, well, that's not HR. It is, because if I don't understand how your business operates, I don't understand its fundamentals, I don't understand how the nuts and bolts are put together and what levers you need to pull to actually generate money versus what actually you spend money on, I can't really do anything to help you. And I'd be lying to you if I said I did. So I understand where you're trying to go, how's your business put together today, and I look for where the gaps are from the people operations perspective. And that takes many forms. First off, do you have the organizational structure in place that facilitates decision making and processes to help you reach the goals you want to reach at the time span you want to reach them and at the budget you can afford to reach them? Do you have the right people who have the skill sets to do that? Do you have the efficient and sustainable operation that can scale, or as you grow revenue, your expenses are actually going to grow exponentially with that? So I look at all of these things and I work with the business to try and dissect all of these things. First, we start with the day-to-day operations, the infrastructure, the people, the structures, the processes, and how do we put in place a reward system that incentivizes people to operate under that new vision and under that new operation. So if you will, that's a bit of a summary of what every kind of engagement looks like. But of course, the details differ based on the business, the environment, the founders, and so forth.
I get it, and it's super important. Like we've been, just build your bench, right? It's building your bench to be able to get to the spot that you're trying, your end goal.
Exactly. I mean, I liken it sometimes. I'm a big Formula One fan. So it's like giving the best driver a very bad car or giving a Ferrari to someone who has never driven a Formula One car before. One without the other doesn't work. You need both together to work. But at the same time, You need the pit bench to be good, because when they go in for a pit stop, right, they can't spend a minute in there. They need to be out there in a couple of seconds, or else they're going to lose the race. So it's a full team effort, but you need a lot of basic components in place to actually give you a chance to succeed and a chance to win and achieve the goal you want to achieve.
So some of these companies that you've helped, two questions behind that. One is the founders or the CEOs that you're working with, are they still wearing many hats, or have they kind of graduated to a more advanced management level where they understand that things do need to get delegated, or are they still trying to do everything?
Yeah, I mean, I've dealt with a mix of all of those together, but for the most part, when I engage with any company, this is one of the first things I actually like to talk about, because if the intention of a founder is to always have control over everything, there's so much you can help them do, because at the end of the day, they're always going to be the bottleneck. So typically engagements like that, over time, I actually used to step away from. Early on in my career, I would take anything and everything that's thrown at me, like most early professionals. But today, if I engage with a founder who I can see very clear as day that is their modus operandi, they will not hand control, and they will not actually allow the business to operate and to scale, then I actually step away from it, because I'm usually very honest. Like, I can't really help you very much, and it would be a bad investment for you to actually hire me, because you're the one who's actually going to be standing in the way. I'll give you an example of a customer I actually worked with a while back, where I was able to help him shift from that mindset to actually hiring a CEO to replace him.
Really?
Completely. That is an extreme. Yeah, that is a complete extreme. Now, it was a 6-month journey, pretty much, because this was a company which dealt in the luxury fashion retail. So it was a company in the Middle East, very heavily funded, very high growth, was growing at triple digits year over year. And when I started working with them, they had about 100 employees. They were available in 3 different countries, but they were hitting a ceiling with revenue, which they couldn't surpass. They were sort of hovering around the 30 million mark, and they were going up and down 5%, and they were just hitting a roadblock every time. So I did pretty much an audit of the organization, just like I was saying earlier, all these elements I look at, and all of the issues always pointed to the founder's capacity and the founder actually bottlenecking decisions. I mean, this was an individual who had to sign off on a light bulb needing to be changed. That was the level of extremity that we were dealing with here. So this was like I like using this example because it's such an extreme shift. So, and I'm not kidding, a light bulb, if it were needed to be purchased, he had to sign off on it.
Wow.
So it was all the way to that extent.
Wow.
What I did is I presented my findings, and in my presentation of findings, I told this individual that my recommendation, if he wants to scale his business, so I presented it this way: if you want to keep your business where it is and it's pretty lucrative and you're making money and you are pretty much living the dream, if this is where you want to stay, keep things as they are. If you want to take this to the next level, my professional and objective recommendation is you need to step down from this role and you need to take on the more creative role, which is what you're good at. Because this was an individual who was the brains behind most of the creative work and the prosperity of the product. So I'm like, you need to focus there, and let's get someone who has done this before for businesses like yours and has helped them grow globally on the business side of things. I was yelled at during that meeting. I kid you not, I was yelled at. And I expected it at the time, that it was not going to be taken lightly. But I told him, listen, I'm just being honest with you, and I want to give you your money's worth here. Sleep on it, and if you're ever ready to move forward, let's talk. 6 months passed by before he called me. And he's like, you know what? I'm willing to give it a shot. Let's try it, right? Let's try it. Let's hire someone for 6 months. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, we go back to how it was. I'm like, sure, let's do that. So I helped him actually poach a CEO from a competitor who was someone who took that competing company globally. Within 18 months, the company more than doubled its revenues and it skyrocketed. And then after that, I mean, we're still very good friends. I worked with that company for around 7 or 8 years, in an advisory capacity. And, it's a global company today. They have, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And the CEO today, He's just the chairman of the board. He is not involved in any of the day-to-day operations.
The
He is
CEO that you helped hire?
Yeah, so the founder, who was
Okay.
the CEO, just took a full step back. He handed complete reins to the new CEO. He even now relegated himself from the creative role. He's just someone
Wow.
who's involved in the ideation process, but not even the execution anymore. And he's like, when I speak to him every now and then, he's like, this was the most liberating decision of my life. It was so scary, and he was so scared at the time because you're giving up so much control over
Yeah.
everything that you've built yourself.
Right.
And it was terrifying for him. But he's like, you know what? This was the most liberating decision of my life. And, I'm happy for it, but it was not easy. And he still tells me, like, I still remember yelling at you so badly. I'm like, I mean, hey, it got us here to this point. So, I mean, it was a win-win situation.
You know, that's, man, I sit here and I think about that. I totally get it. I mean, the thought of having someone come in here and run everything. Now, like, I know I could do that. If there was somebody better than me that could run my businesses better than me and help scale, 100%. But to be completely removed and uninvolved, that's what I don't know if I could do, because it's like, what do I do with my time? You know, every person that's ever started a business, I'm sure, could relate, and knowing that you're working from the time that you wake up until you go to bed. And so
Yes.
your time is always occupied with putting fires out, handling employee problems, handling sales problems, maintenance problems, you name it. The toilet's clogged. You got people that are calling you. So to not have those anymore, I'd be like, well, what the hell should I do now?
Yeah, it's a journey, right? It's so whenever that happens, and whenever you want to start going through that journey, it's not an on-off switch that happens overnight, right? Even with that same example I gave, until that new CEO really had full reins 100%, it really was a couple of months in, because you need to build that trust. When you're a business owner and you've built that company from the ground up, it's your baby, right? And you're not going to hand it over to anyone with that risk of, hey, they might crash this to the ground, and I spent all my time and effort and really my life into this. I'm not going to let that happen.
Right.
But also, the trust is built with execution. It's built with results. And that's why typically when I work with founders I'm taking with them on that journey, we start by picking bits and pieces of things that they are willing to delegate first, and look at the outcomes from that delegation. And typically with success, that is when they become, the idea becomes more palatable to actually keep doing it, because, hey, this wasn't so bad and that wasn't so bad.
Right.
Well, let's keep doing this. And then with baby steps, well, the whole thing wasn't so bad. Well, that's great. And that time they free up, typically, they end up investing in other ventures, in other ideas, in other things that they were so drowned with the day-to-day that they just couldn't do anymore and they were exhausted to do. I've seen a lot of founders who went through this journey. It actually had such a positive impact on their health, mental and physical.
Oh, I can see
Because,
that. Yeah.
right? Because, and I've been through this before. When you're so invested in your business, you're working those 12 to 16-hour days every day, 7 days a week. Something's got to give. You're not able, you can't do everything at the same time. You're going to sacrifice your health, your relationships, and so forth. And by stepping away, it actually helps them with all of these things. And, they're all the better for it.
Yep. Do you think, out of all the companies that you've worked for, or worked with, I should say, do you think there's been a commonality in the position that is hired that helps scale the business?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's a commonality in like a position specifically, but there are certain symptoms and things that I see that are recurring in almost every company I've worked with. And once they solve those things, they start to take off. First and foremost and I see this a lot, especially with first-time founders. When first-time founders start hiring their initial founding team, and again, it could be people who they have relationships with in the past. They could be friends, family, college roommates, people that they have good relationships with. Once the business starts experiencing some level of success, the assumption is that, hey, we got this far, right? What worked for us today and got us here is going to get us there. That is seldom the case, especially if you start hitting those, 7-figure marks and so forth. Like a 10-person company is very different than a 50-person company, very different than a 100, 200, 300-person company.
Oh, yes.
The dynamics are very different.
Yep.
The stakes are very different. So one of the biggest things I see is that founders who get stuck on, hey, I can't move on from these people. And I'm not saying fire them, right? I'm like, hey, you need to reassess where they fit into the organization
Mm-hmm.
and plug in the deficits with people who actually are able to take you over the hump.
Mm-hmm.
Founders who typically get stuck on that piece usually stagnate or actually crash. Those who are able to overcome this, and again, it's a journey as well, it ends up being a win-win for everyone because you don't put people who you trust in a position where they're going to fail because they don't have the skill set to take you to the next stage that you want to go to.
Sure.
At the same time, you bring in people who can do that. You win, they win, and everyone goes, everyone's happy.
Yep.
That's one of the most common things I see. And that is probably without exception with most of the companies I've worked with. That is something that happens all the time. The second one we talked about, which is really that whole consolidation of decision-making power and authority with the founder or a few people. And the dangerous part is when those people aren't the best people to make those decisions. Mm-hmm. And it's not usually the founder only. I'll give you an example. There was a PC gaming peripherals company I was working with a couple years ago where there was an individual in the organization who was making some financial decisions on inventory and how much inventory we should carry. And the person had never in their life done anything like that. They don't even know the basics of inventory management. They didn't even know the production costs to the full extent. And they were even calculating all of the items that contributed to production costs,
Right.
and inventory costs. So you can imagine what that looked like, right? I mean, this was a company that was carrying way more inventory than they needed to, spending a lot of money, and they had essentially dead stock sitting around for a lot of cases. As soon as that was just handed over to an existing employee, another person, an existing employee who actually had the skill sets, right? The whole thing changed like night and day. The profitability increased, the expenses went down, stocking was no longer an issue, and so forth. So sometimes just the reallocation of decision-making power and authority also plays a big difference. The final thing, which I think is pretty common, and that's where typically most companies come to me for, is they start running into a lot of people problems once they start hitting like the 30 to 50 employee mark. Compliance issues, treating contractors like employees, and getting into a lot of, I would say, dangerous territory when it comes to compliance issues and how they operate on a day-to-day basis from an HR perspective. So all of these things can be avoided for very minimal investments early on in the company's tenure by setting up your employment operation properly and compliantly. Because I've worked with companies before who were hit with 6 and 7 figure bills, right, for penalties and all that kind of stuff because they were pretty sloppy with how they did those things. And these are things that can be avoided, right?
Yeah.
Those, I would say, are the most common things I see that actually hold some companies back, at least in those initial stages.
I just dealt with that myself in my one company. We have all of our Group X instructors in the gyms are 1099, and it's that's pretty standard in the industry because a lot of these instructors work at other gyms.
Exactly.
They're not employees; they're contractors. They use their own music. They create their own workouts, all of that stuff. And the state came in, audited me, and ding, and me, because I'm stubborn, decided to fight it, right? And the bill overall was minimal, but it was more principle, right?
Yeah.
Because in my mind, I was like, okay, if I agree to just pay this and go away, well, now they can re-audit me in future years or past years and try and ding me again.
Yeah.
And so I ended up spending like 10 grand in attorney fees trying to fight, a $1,500 bill. Now, most people will say that's stupid, but my mentality at the time was, well, I spent 10, but let's say I won, that would have saved me thousands in the future from them re-auditing me again. And it's very frustrating because I learned a lot from that situation. Basically, it doesn't. I could have spent the money to continue to fight it. I decided to just lick my wounds and move on. But when the government gets involved, like forget it. Like it's over.
Yeah, there's a company I worked with who had a contractor employee situation in the UK. They ended up with around a 700,000 British pound bill.
Jeez.
That is not small money, right?
No.
Now, this was a company that makes, tens of millions of dollars, but again, that is an avoidable expense. And again, there are things that you can do with very minimal changes. A lot of it is how you set things up behind the scenes, how you make sure everything is set up in a compliant way that if you go through an audit, everything looks clean and you're actually implementing it and everyone's happy. And sometimes the tricky thing with these things is that they're not always logical and crystal clear to the typical business person, right? You're like, why is this a problem? This makes no sense.
Yep.
Well, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, you just need to be aware of it and make sure that you mitigate for it. But yeah, those are some things that ding some companies. And if you're a very small company and you get hit with something like this, sometimes it could be something which is really damaging to your overall operation.
Yeah.
Like imagine that kind of bill hitting a company that's making, $1 million or less a year. That is not small money, right? They could be doing a lot of things with that money.
Yeah.
So yeah, it could hurt your operations, and it could be such a trivial thing that is avoidable.
Yeah. And to your point earlier in the podcast, I mean, I think that's where HR specialists are very important for organizations. I mean, even when I was smaller, that was one of my first hires that I did just on a consulting basis, not in as a W-2, but I hired an HR specialist to help me put together job descriptions. How do we interview people? How do we do terminations? How do we do performance reviews? All of that stuff, because to me, like, if you have to have processes in your business to handle most situations, right? Processes,
I agree.
SOPs, all that stuff.
I agree. And I love that you say that, because a lot of times, and this is sometimes, I would say, self-inflicted from HR professionals, is a lot of people associate HR with bureaucracy, red tape. They're going to make our lives difficult. We just want to get business done, and we want to make money. We want to grow. Stop putting sticks in our wheels.
Yeah.
Now, there are HR professionals who are like that, unfortunately, and they give others, in the space, a bad rap. The sweet spot that I like to think of is that you need to put structure in place to the extent where it serves the business, doesn't actually hinder the business. That is the sweet spot for me. Whenever I want to give any recommendation or help a founder make any decision on something related to process, SOP, systems, how does this help us do business better? If I can't answer that, or it's a fuzzy thing that we need to think of, then hey, let's take a step back here and assess, what are we trying to solve for?
Yeah.
Because if we're putting something in place just for the sake of it, then it doesn't need to be in there at all. And again, that's why when I first started, it's so important to understand the business and how it operates and how it runs, because in the absence of that information, you're just going to be operating in an echo chamber in your HR bubble and just trying to copy, paste, rinse and repeat stuff that you've done in other companies and try to bring them to this company. Well, what worked in company A doesn't necessarily work for company B.
Sure.
And that's a hole that a lot of HR professionals fall into. And that's why I kind of personally try to step away from that so much, because if you're not helping move the business forward, you're not adding any value. There's no purpose for you to be there.
Has there been a company or organization that you've worked with where it was like one of your hardest, consultant jobs that you've had to do?
Yeah. There's one that always comes to mind. So
There's always one.
Yeah, there's always one. So this was a telecom company, right, in Africa. So I'm not going to mention the country, because then it's going to reveal who they are. And again, with all the projects, I'm under NDAs not to reveal this stuff. So
Sure.
it was a telecom company with 40,000 employees, right? Not a small organization, half government owned. That was where the tricky part was coming in, because the main purpose of my engagement, and this was an engagement that I was hired by one of the top 4 consulting firms to actually go and work with them on that project. Also because I speak multiple languages, and that was also helping with the relationships. but also it was the main mandate of the project was, hey, we think we're bloated as an organization. We want to see where the inefficiencies are and what we need to do to actually trim down our operation, but also not ding our revenues and so forth. So again, you can imagine whenever a company starts saying that, means that they're telling you, hey, where can we trim some of the fat? So we spent around 4 months flying back and forth to that location, and really this was a 7-person job for all that time period. So it was a big project, and once we did the analysis and so forth, we found out that a lot of these hires were sort of like ghost jobs. They didn't exist. There was a lot of people on payroll who didn't actually show up. So out of the 40,000, there's actually only 23,000 who were doing any work.
No.
Yes.
Half?
I kid you not. 23,000 out of the 40,000 employees were actually showing up. The others, we did not know who they were. We even looked for them. We couldn't find them.
Wow.
They were people who stayed at home, but because, there was some corruption involved, of course.
Sure.
So this was pretty big because we sort of uncovered government corruption.
Sure.
And we're like, okay, what do we do with this?
Yeah.
So we took this to the CEO of the company, right? And it turns out he was kind of in on it, which was the more interesting thing. So
Of course he was.
right, but on the other end is we were contracted with them, but also the government entity. So we had to actually report to the government entity. The government entity who was overseeing the telecom company was the Ministry of Telecom. So we ended up going to the Minister of Telecom with this information, like, hey, this is what we found, right? He was not in on it. So
Wow.
he's like, what do you mean? You guys are telling me that half the workforce isn't there. So most of this project for me was relationship management and trying to overcome sort of the political sensitivities and all that kind of stuff. Now, we got a lot of heat, my team and I. Like
I'm sure.
we went from getting free lunches every day at the company and coffees to our desk to people avoiding us and giving us, the side eye
Yeah.
as we walked in, because like, hey, these guys are trying to ding our friends here.
Yep.
So the project was paused for a couple of months. The ministry actually sent people in to do their own investigation and audit. Almost the entire leadership team was let go, completely, almost all of it. And most of everyone who was on payroll, who should not have been, was actually trimmed out. And they brought us back in later to reinvestigate and help them come up with a new organization structure. But the people who were left there, a lot of them were kind of in on it as well, and were kind of supporting of what was going on. It was such a difficult time that no one would work with us almost. People would give us very dry answers, would not give us even like basic documentation. We had to go to the minister every now and then just to get an executive order to hand us documents that should have been handed to us. It was pretty tough. But we ended up delivering sort of the project and giving them sort of what they needed and all that. But we weren't part of the execution of it. We were just like, hey, this is what needs to happen now. God bless you. Go figure it out and implement it. Because I'm not touching this anymore because this is kind of getting too hot. And it was a situation where you're kind of set up to fail. But it was a big learning opportunity. And I think it was the first time where I felt I was actually doing more politics than actual work, just because of the nature of it. But it was such an interesting dynamic with all the factors in play. So I would say that was by far the most difficult one I worked on, given the stakes that were at play here and kind of the stakeholders as well.
Did you fear for your life at all while you were there? I mean,
no, it wasn't that bad,
Yeah.
really. And I come from Lebanon, so it's a third world country which is notorious for stuff like that. So for me, I was like, I've seen this before. I'm like, that's I kind of know where you guys are coming from, but hear me out here.
Yeah.
So, but again, when I tell this story to my U.S. friends, they're like, "What are you talking? Like, really? That's a thing?" I'm like, "Yes, it's a thing." But no, it was a hostile environment. Like, think of the most hostile professional environment you can think of.
Sure.
It was really at that point.
Sure.
It was borderline harassing to some extent.
Sure.
Like, for example, if I had, let's say, a meeting with one of the executives who was kind of in on the whole game, they'd make me wait 3 hours in front of their, in their reception area while they were inside, just to make my life miserable.
Oh my God.
So yeah, I went through a lot of those things as well. But again, given that I'm from a culture perspective, I kind of seen similar things before. So we're like, okay, I know what's going on here. Whereas, the other folks who are on the product, like, what is happening? Like, what is going on here? We don't understand. I'm like, guys, okay, let me give you a crash course 101 in how things happen in this part of the world sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Let's go through that. And how are some ways to mitigate and sort of try to get to what we want to get to as well. So yeah, it was pretty interesting.
How long in total were you on that project?
So, I mean, total, it was around 7 months between the on and offs and so forth. It was a pretty lengthy one.
And so, afterwards, have you looked up or seen how they're doing now? Or are they back to what they were doing, or have they improved?
So I heard through the grapevine that they did veer a little bit into what they were doing. Not to the extent it was before, because again, with politics, minister changes and executive changes here and there. So yeah, they did veer back a little bit, but to my understanding, it's not to the same extent. Again, it takes time to slip in 20,000 people undocumented. That takes a lot of time and years of effort. I mean, there were some stories where people who had actually passed away were still on payroll and their kids were collecting the checks. I mean, there was some crazy stuff that we were uncovering.
It's kind of like the supposed Social Security situation we have going on right now.
I know, huh? Oh yeah. So it was exactly.
That is wild, man. Half of the workforce was wow.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, corruption. I mean, it takes many shapes and forms when you see it. But yeah, this was an egregious one for sure. Like, I had never seen anything like that before.
Yeah.
So I'm like, yeah, it was eye opening for me. But in hindsight, it is kind of comedic to some extent when I try to think of the day to day stuff I was actually doing over there. I was like, wow, this is crazy. It's like something out of a movie.
Yeah.
But
I've read from several sources that are saying that Africa is poised to be the fastest growing economy in the world.
Yes. I mean, I've done like 5 to 6 projects with companies there.
Really?
I mean, one of the biggest things going for it is it has the youngest population in the world. If you look at the continents, like the US and Europe, we're aging, right?
Yeah.
The average age in the European continent is something like 23.
Yeah, less and less people are having kids.
Exactly. Whereas in Africa, the workforce is so young. I read a statistic the other day. I can't remember where it came from, but it's like almost 40 to 50% of the workforce in the next 50 years is probably going to come from that continent, because we're going to be old by then, and we're not having kids.
Yeah.
Like the world's workforce is mostly going to be probably from that area and surrounding regions. Also, it's a continent that is very resource rich, but unfortunately it's hit with so much corruption.
Yeah.
Where there's a big segregation of wealth there's a lot of wealthy people and there's a lot of poverty over there.
Yeah.
That middle ground, middle income folks just don't exist in a lot of places there. And some of the companies I've worked with over there, you would not believe the amounts of revenues and profits they make. And you think, give you a small example. I worked with a supermarket once, a small supermarket that is half the size of a Target, and that's just one store. They generate around $70 to $80 million in revenue.
What?
Yes, in Congo,
what?
Which is like I could not believe that. I mean, that is wild, and a lot of their products, almost all of it's imported. There's a lot of money that's spent on just tariffs and all that kind of stuff, and transportation, and even paying people off just to get your products into the door, and they make that much money in a country which is considered one of the poorest, but also one of the most corrupt, and a war-torn country, and you have a single supermarket, just one supermarket, making that much money. It's wild stuff.
Any idea like what kind of margin it was at 70 or 80 million?
I think it was around 8 to 9%,
which is crazy. That's 3 times what it is here in the States.
Exactly. Because also what happens in those countries is that you don't have a lot of options and a lot of competition either. So you might find a certain brand.
Yep.
Let's say I don't know, Kellogg's, right?
Yeah.
Kellogg's, you'll find maybe one or two stores that carry that. So you're funneling sort of all of the customers in there, and the prices are pretty expensive. Like if you compare the prices there, like if you're buying, let's say, a bottle of orange juice, at Target here, you're probably spending somewhere like, $5 to $8 depending on the brand.
Yep.
Over there, it's something like 15,
Oh my
right?
God.
But people buy it. So, and again, that's the separation of wealth that you have. I mean, I once saw it with my own two eyes that same supermarket, a person walk in and buy $16,000 worth of flowers for his daughter's 16th birthday.
In the Congo.
Yes. At a supermarket.
Wow.
I don't even know why a supermarket carries that much flowers, but I'm like, there must be a clientele for it. Yeah, I mean, there's some crazy stuff you will see there. But again, there's few businesses that can do that. They kind of monopolize a lot of extent the market, but there's a lot to go around. It's a resource rich continent.
Sure.
But I mean, there's been a lot of developments happening there, a lot of investments. There's a growing tech ecosystem that's going on there. There's a lot of VCs that are not actually interested in that continent. So yeah, I mean, it is on the up and up for sure.
That blows my mind. That blows my mind. Especially when you sit back and you think about like high school and you learn about Africa and you learn about the Congo and everything you taught were it was a bunch of clashes and wars, and yes, there's corruption, but not supermarkets that are making $80 million a year.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the owners of that supermarket, I mean, they are one of the wealthiest people I've ever seen in my life, because
Really?
I mean, the amount of properties they own, the cars, the universities they send their kids to, like their kids all went to school here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Right? You mean they have vacation houses in Paris and in London,
Wow.
and all that kind of stuff, and all from that one supermarket. But I mean, if you're making that much money, I mean, of course you're gonna be able to do all that kind of stuff.
I'm doing
so
something wrong in
it's a small family business.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, and
I
they
remember,
employ around 30 people.
30 people?
Yeah, that's it. That's the whole operation.
Wow.
Yeah, mind blowing.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
When I bought my current vehicle, the one of the sales guys that I was working with was from Africa. He moved here, and he's actually a tribal leader, but he lives here. But he's got like kind of like what we talked about earlier. He's kind of got a COO of the. That's not what they call him, but that's what he is for the tribe. And if there's disputes between families or disputes about crops or whatever, they have to call him here in the States, and he's the final decision maker. I was fascinated with the conversation with him because, obviously that's nothing that's happens here in the States, right? And I'm sure not in Lebanon either, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny you should say that, because my mom was raised in Ghana in Africa, so I know a lot about how things happen over there and all that kind of thing. So yeah, that is not uncommon. Like we've had before, like chiefs, of tribes visit us, let's say in Lebanon, because they were family friends, and on my mom's side and so forth, and they would get calls about some, dispute over a border of land.
Right.
Like, hey, this person's planting their crops a couple of feet into my land. How do we resolve this? And he would actually be, mediating that conversation over the phone across, continents.
Yeah.
Because he's a tribal chief. I mean, yeah, it's very fascinating.
It's wild. And he was, because he was talking about how, I asked, like, what are the main differences between what you see in the culture of Africa versus the culture of America? And the first thing that he said is how they raise their kids. He said, my children never disrespect me. And he said, it reminds me of, did you ever see Eddie Murphy's stand-up comedy Raw?
Yeah.
And where he talks about he's going to get a girl, and his friend was going to get what was the girl from? I think from Africa. And, no, his friend had an Asian girl, and he said he walked up and asked the girl a question, and the girl looked at him, and he said, "You may speak." And she answered. But that's basically what he, in a way, was saying about, like, with his children and the family is like, the kids don't talk back. They're utmost respect. if adults are in a room, the children are not allowed in the room. They have to go somewhere else in the house. And that blew
Yeah.
my mind because that is not how it is here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the benefits I think of sort of this diverse kind of experience I've had cross continent has
Mm-hmm.
helped me really see a lot of sort of the benefits, the pros and cons of a lot of different cultures. And so there's no one best way, right?
Yeah.
There's pros and cons to everything.
Yeah.
You know, one of the pros that we have, let's say in the U.S. here, that hey, you'll learn to be independent, to speak your mind,
Mm-hmm.
you know, to have an opinion, not shy away from it. But sometimes we might take it overboard and become, you know, very brash with other people, disrespectful, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yep.
On the other spectrum, right? Even this is the same thing where I come from, also in the Middle East, is that the norm is that if there's an adult in the room and they speak, you kind of quote unquote obey. And you do not really try to fight that opinion, regardless of whether it's right or wrong, which is also, you know, it has its own downsides, right?
Yeah.
Because the oldest person isn't necessarily the person who's always right or the wisest person.
Sure.
And again, I think one of the things that have helped me personally is understanding these dynamics helps you navigate certain situations in different cultures. Because the way I work with a CEO in the Middle East is very different than how I work with a CEO in the US versus
Sure.
a CEO in Africa versus a CEO in the UK.
Sure.
Very different, right? And having that, you know, I've worked. I think I counted it. I think a couple of years ago. I have had interactions with about 100 nationalities.
Wow.
And I think, you know, it's been a very good thing in my career. It's actually been a blessing, just because it's allowed me to be more successful than others would have been working with multinational folks. Not because I'm smarter than anyone, but just because I've had the exposure, and I kind of understand how certain dynamics play out and how to, you know, say the same thing but in a different way and put different context around it to sort of resonate with your audience. And, you know, it's kind of the same concept that people learn when they're trying to sell. Like, you know, hey, position your message to the audience. It's the same thing, but you're applying it around all of your communications, especially when you're dealing with high stakes things around, you know, business decisions and some of the things that we've been talking about.
That is a super valuable skill, right? If you can work with different people from different cultures and in all of their traditions and whatnot, I mean, that's super valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I've won deals just on that piece of information alone, really.
Really.
I've had companies before who were sort of, you know, trying to, you know, like most companies, when you're hiring, you know, an advisor, consultant, whatever, you're not going to talk to one person only, right? Unless they were recommended by someone you highly trust and telling you, hey, just blindly hire them, they're going to deliver, right? Which is an outlier. It doesn't happen every day. But most times they're going to be talking to, you know, at least 2 to 3 people or
Yeah.
companies. And a lot of times, especially with international companies or companies that are global, when they just learn that about my experience, they're like, okay, you get it. If another company doesn't, they're automatically discounted out of the equation. And I understand why. But again, it's one of those things where there's some high stakes decisions and circumstances that you kind of are exposed to when you're working globally, and your way of doing things isn't always going to be accepted. And I'll give you an example of the cultural things that I went through early on in my career. So, and hence I'm from the Middle East, so I'm supposedly should be understanding that culture. Saudi Arabia also happens to be in the Middle East, but it's a very different culture than what I've been used to.
Sure.
So I was on a project there once with one of the major banks in that country. This was early on in my career, when I was still doing like a lot of, you know, big consulting with some large firms. This was like a 5,000 person bank, and I was presenting an idea of how they can measure the capacity of their branch tellers, so they can determine how many people they need every time they open a new branch. Sort of giving them like some mathematical equations and I'm big on numbers and data as well. So I was presenting sort of my approach and how mathematically I got to that. And the head of the department raised his hand. He's like, I don't agree with that. So, and we started having a conversation. I'm like, and I'm trying to understand why he doesn't agree with that. So at the end of the day, he was answering me in a way which is very vague and not concrete. Like, I'm speaking in numbers and mathematical formulas. You're speaking in ideas. So I walked up to him in a very respectful manner, and I was actually on a whiteboard writing. So I walk up to this gentleman. I'm like, hey, would you mind showing me on the board what exactly it is you're trying to tell me? Because I can't really put it together here. So he refused to do that. and he stopped engaging completely with me. A couple of hours later, after the meeting ended, I get a call from the company. They're canceling the contract with me. The reason being is that senior person took my approach as disrespecting and challenging him in front of his direct reports.
Okay.
So it's like, you're putting me on the spot in front of the people who report to me, and you shouldn't have done that in that forum. We should have had this maybe in a private conversation. Whereas if you did this maybe here in the US, right, it might have been taken that same way, or probably much better, right? Maybe not to that extreme.
Yep.
So that for me is like, okay, wow, I was completely oblivious to that. So, and after I actually recounted that story to multiple people in the country there, they're like, oh yeah, of course they did that. I'm like, I'm surprised they didn't kick you out of the room then and there.
Wow.
Like, okay, that is interesting. So I've had a lot of situations like this happen before, international, with some international work.
Yeah.
But again, it's so eye-opening because right now when I'm in similar situations, I think through it in a very different perspective. And I approach it in a very different light as well.
How did you even get involved in this business? And not only that, but how do you even find your customers to get all these projects? I mean, especially internationally.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So one of the strategies that I had is, first of all, I leveraged my ability to speak multiple languages. So I speak English, Arabic, and some French. So that really helps. First off, when you want to work internationally, there's a big subset of countries that actually operate and use those languages as their first language. Mm-hmm. The second thing I did is, when I was initially starting out in consulting, is I didn't have the capital to actually go out and do all of this, marketing prospecting. What I did is I actually connected with a lot of consulting companies who offered broad strategic management consulting, but their weak point was the HR element. They did not have that capability in a mature level. So what I did at the time is, and that's actually what actually propelled me in the consulting space, is I worked with a lot of the big global consulting companies, like the BCGs, McKinsey's, PwC's, those kind of folks.
Yep.
And I'm like, hey, I am your person for hire whenever you have specific HR related issues. And I had a team of professionals with me that I had actually sourced as well that would work with me on projects.
Yep.
So that's kind of how I started out. And a lot of times they're like, you speak this language, and we have, and those companies have a lot of physical presence and branches in a lot of these countries, and they're available globally. And they actually share resources with each other. So what would happen is, and most of them, they have databases which are accessible across the globe. So if, let's say, there's a project, let's say with Google, right? And Google is working, they have offices in Dubai, for example. And then the project is out of Dubai. Doesn't mean all the consultants have to come from there. They actually look at their global databases and see, okay, who fits the skill set we need? Who knows the culture? Who knows the language? Who's done work in the region? Those people go to the top of the list typically. And that's kind of what made me go up to the top of the list in a lot of these international projects as well. And that's kind of how it happened. And it actually spiraled from there because, as you start building a track record with these firms, and you start having references and so forth, then it kind of snowballs. And that's kind of how it happened. So I started doing that in 2011. So a pretty long time ago. And right now, I have enough of a wide client base where a lot of my customers today come from referrals or people who actually find out about my content online, or they land on the website through the podcast and so forth. They're like, hey, this is interesting stuff. We kind of have some of these issues and some of these problems. Let's talk.
That's cool.
And that's kind of how it happens for the most part today. I still have a lot of relationships with a lot of firms, but I work with a lot of VCs, PE firms as well, because I like to focus so much more right now on these growing, scaling companies. And how I got into that world is in the start of my career, just because I was doing mostly big consulting stuff and did not have really startup experience, I did about 2 to 3 years of pro bono work with VCs and PE firms. I'm like, hey, let's just see if I add value here.
Yeah.
I already was making money from my other work. I'm like, hey, this was a sector I was so interested in. Because I come from a family of entrepreneurs as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, hey, I'm really interested in that space and helping in that space as well. And that's kind of how I got into the startup ecosystem, is because I actually offered my services up for free I'm like, hey guys, just
That's
try
smart.
me out. If you like it, great. If you don't, you don't. And then that's how kind of actually gain some traction there too.
That was smart, especially on the VC and PE side. That was
Yeah,
awesome.
exactly. And it was a lot of learning as well, because for me, I was like, hey, this is a win-win, right? I mean, if I can add value, that's amazing. And you get so much exposure to so many companies at once.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much diversity. And it's like it's like someone opened up a fire hose at you.
Yeah.
Drinking from a fire hose. That is exactly what that looked like at the time, but also very, very valuable.
So my last question for you is, as a founder, are you still in the trenches, or are you at the 30,000-foot view? Kind of related back to one of the earlier questions I asked about.
Yeah,
Other
yeah,
people you've worked
amazing.
with.
No, I love that question. So I would say I'm at the 20,000 view, maybe not at the 30,000 view, because generally speaking, I have over time delegated more and more work. The tricky thing with consulting, which is something I'm actually working towards, is that a lot of times when a customer or company is used to working with you and they come for you,
Yep.
they want you.
Yep.
Although I have a team that works with me and folks that support me and all that kind of stuff, a lot of times when it comes to the really high stakes things, I'm usually the one they want to, let's say, go present to the board, or someone who's going to go help them pitch with an investor, to sign off on an idea, if like their VC backed firm or so forth. But if it comes like, I really don't engage anymore in sort of the day-to-day operations when it comes to some of the consulting work that happens at all. Because typically I only work with sort of the high level executives on the big picture stuff. Now, again, there are situations where I roll up my sleeves and I do the work entirely if needed.
Yeah.
But those are far and few in between now. And I'm really spending most of my time today on strategic work. Actually, I'm spending a lot of time on the podcast, a lot of time on content
great.
generation. I'm doing a lot of that today, as opposed to doing a lot of the day-to-day consulting stuff. I'm also building a lot. I'm building a lot of resources right now. Some of them free, some of them, like products for founders and leaders and so forth. Like coursework, resources, playbooks, templates, frameworks. I'm spending a lot of time on this stuff today, as well. Hopefully, to get me completely to that 30,000 foot view.
Well, when you get all of that stuff built out and ready to launch, let's bring you back on, because I really enjoyed talking to you, and I think you provide a tremendous amount of value out there.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And
Where
this was
can
an amazing
everyone reach
conversation.
you or find where you're at?
Yeah, so there's two easy ways you can reach me. First off is you can reach me on LinkedIn. Just type in my name there. I'll pop up. Or you can visit my website, which is www.atorganizedchaos.fyi. That is the name of the podcast, Organized Chaos.
I love it.
And so, yeah, that's I love the name just because it is such a representation of what startup life looks like.
It totally is. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, those are the two ways you can reach me. If anyone prefers also email, you can reach me at hello@organizedchaos.fyi. So those I would say are the best ways to get to me.
I'll be sure to put all of that in the show notes. My man, thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
I appreciate it. Thank you.